You didn't chase them. You didn't try to prove anything. You simply moved on. You found someone who actually shows up. Someone who treats you the way you always deserved. And suddenly the person who couldn't give you that is the one trying to come back. So the real question is, why do they want you now when you finally stop needing them? If this kind of psychological clarity is useful to you, subscribe. There's more coming. Here's the misunderstanding most people carry into this moment. They believe the person came back because they realized your worth. That's a romantic idea. It's also largely incorrect. Worth is something you either perceive or you don't. And if someone consistently failed to perceive yours across weeks, months, or years of direct experience with you, a new person treating you well doesn't suddenly illuminate your value to them. What it illuminates is their ego position. Here's the mechanism. Every person who undervalues someone in a relationship develops an unconscious assumption of availability. They don't think about it consciously. They don't decide to take you for granted. But somewhere beneath the surface, the operating belief is, they'll be there. I don't have to work for this. This is secured. That assumption is the foundation of the dynamic. And when someone else enters the picture, someone who treats you visibly, consistently, genuinely better, that assumption shatters. Not because they suddenly love you more, because they suddenly feel less. Their identity had a component in it that was quietly built on the contrast between your need for them and their relative indifference. And now that contrast has inverted. You're not the one waiting. You're the one being chosen. And that inversion triggers something that is almost nothing to do with you and everything to do with them. This is the ego crash. And understanding it changes everything about how you respond. There's a sequence to how this unfolds. It doesn't happen all at once. The first phase is what you could call the assumption phase. During this period, the person who undervalued you operated from a quiet, unexamined confidence. Not arrogance necessarily, just a settled belief that you were emotionally available to them regardless of how they behaved. There was no urgency, no need to show up fully. The relationship, or whatever remained of it, felt like a fixed point, stable, accessible, theirs, in some diffuse, undefined way. Externally, they were inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, present only when convenient. Internally, they were not conflicted. They were comfortable. And that comfort was built entirely on your continued presence and what they read as your continued need. Then comes the disruption phase. Something shifts in your behavior. Maybe it's subtle at first. You stop initiating. Your energy changes. You seem different, less oriented toward them. And then they see it. Someone else is in the picture. Someone who is giving you what they withheld. Externally, they begin to re-engage. A message out of nowhere. A comment on something you posted. An unexpected check-in that feels slightly too casual to be casual. Internally, something has detonated. The assumption of availability, the quiet foundation their ego was resting on, has just been removed. And the psychological response to that isn't love. It's loss aversion. It's the sudden visceral awareness that something they considered theirs is no longer waiting for them. This is not the same thing as realizing your worth. This is the fear of losing a position. And that fear can feel, from the inside, indistinguishable from desire. The third phase is the performance phase. Now they show up in ways that would have meant everything 6 months ago. They're attentive. They're communicative. They say the things you needed to hear when you actually needed to hear them. And here's where it gets psychologically complicated, because it can look like growth. It can look like the version of them you always believed was possible. And part of you wants to receive it as that. But the honest psychological question is, what changed in them? Or what changed in your circumstances? Because if what changed was your circumstances, if the only catalyst for their transformation was external threat, then what you're witnessing isn't growth. It's reactivity. And reactivity is not a foundation. It's a response to pressure. And pressure, once removed, no longer sustains the behavior it created. The fourth phase is the entitlement return. Beneath the renewed attention, there's often an unspoken expectation that you will receive this new version of them with gratitude, that their return, their effort, their changed behavior earns immediate re-entry. This is where the ego structure reveals itself most clearly, because genuine growth doesn't arrive with expectation. It arrives with humility. It doesn't require you to immediately respond. It doesn't become cold or punishing if you don't. But ego-driven return does. If the effort isn't matched quickly enough, you'll notice the attention beginning to cool, the urgency fading, because the effort was never really about you. It was about restoring their sense of position. Watch for that. It tells you everything. Most people, when they see someone they still care about suddenly showing up fully, finally becoming what they needed, feel relieved. They interpret it as confirmation, as the arrival of something they've been waiting for. And so they move toward it. They welcome it quickly. They set aside the months of inconsistency because this right here looks like what they always wanted. That reaction is understandable. It's also the moment that resets the entire dynamic back to zero. Because the moment you rush toward their renewed attention, you restore the original assumption. You confirm that your availability was always there, that the threat was temporary, that you can be resecured without real change. Now contrast that with a different response. You notice what's happening. You feel the pull, because the pull is real. But you don't let the pull make the decision. You stay where you are. You observe. You give it time, not as a strategy, but because time is the only thing that distinguishes genuine change from panic-driven performance. You ask the honest question, is this who they've become, or is this who they're performing under pressure? And you let the answer reveal itself through consistency, not through words, not through a single elevated moment, but through sustained behavior over time. That's not coldness, that's clarity. There are 5 principles that govern how you move through this moment without losing yourself to it. The first is called position awareness. Before you respond to their re-emergence, you need to understand what position you're in right now. You are in a position of clarity. You have information they don't want you to have. You know exactly who they were when they felt secure with you. That information is not something to weaponize, but it is something to hold. Position awareness means you don't abandon that clarity in the relief of their return. The second principle is emotional pace regulation. The ego crash creates urgency in them. That urgency can transfer to you if you're not careful. Suddenly, the relationship feels live again, active, moving quickly. Emotional pace regulation means you deliberately slow your internal response time. You don't match their urgency. You set your own rhythm. Because urgency that comes from their ego crisis is not your urgency to carry. The third is behavioral evidence weighting. Words that arrive during the ego crash are the least reliable data you have. They're generated by the situation, not by the person's actual development. Behavioral evidence, what they do over time, how they show up when the threat is no longer acute, whether the change persists after the anxiety fades. That is the only data worth weighting heavily. Train yourself to downgrade words and upgrade observed patterns. The fourth principle is called self-reference maintenance. During this period, there is a gravitational pull toward making their return the center of your attention. Self-reference maintenance is the practice of keeping yourself as your own reference point. Your decisions come from your values, your needs, your assessment of what is actually good for you, not from the emotional temperature of their current behavior. You stay oriented toward yourself, not toward the drama of their re-emergence. The fifth is consequence holding. This is the willingness to stay with the outcome, even if it's uncomfortable. If they were genuinely capable of treating you well all along and chose not to, that has consequences, not punitive consequences. Natural ones. The consequence of demonstrating who you become when you feel safe. That information matters. And holding it means you don't erase it simply because the current moment feels hopeful. This situation is about more than a relationship dynamic. It's about what you're willing to accept as evidence of your value. Because here's what this moment is actually showing you. Someone only recognized what they had when the possibility of losing it became concrete. That's not a small thing. That's a fundamental statement about how they process value. And if you return to the dynamic without accounting for that, without real change, real accountability, real time, you don't just re-enter the relationship. You re-enter as someone who taught them that the minimum is enough. You don't accept proof of your worth from someone who only offers it under pressure. You don't mistake reactivity for transformation. You don't let someone's ego crisis become your emotional emergency. And you don't shrink back to the version of yourself that was waiting for them. Not when you've already seen who you are when you stopped waiting. You define value. You don't negotiate for it. You don't react to their panic. You respond from your peace. Those are different things. Completely different. Zoom out for a moment. The ego crash is one of the most revealing dynamics in human relationships because it shows you, with unusual clarity, what someone actually valued about you. Was it you? Or was it the position you occupied in their life? Was it the connection? Or was it the certainty that you'd always be accessible? Self-worth isn't something someone else verifies for you by wanting you back. It's something you build through how you respond when someone has shown you exactly who they are. Emotional intelligence, at its highest level, isn't the ability to decode other people's behavior. It's the ability to remain anchored in your own truth while that behavior is unfolding around you. Personal power isn't the ability to make someone want you. It's the ability to be completely uninterested in the approval of anyone who failed to show up when you needed them to. So here's the question worth sitting with. Not, should I give them another chance? But what version of you do you want to be when this chapter is over? Because that answer, more than anything else, will determine what you accept, what you build, and what you refuse to settle for ever again. That's not a question about them. That's a question about you. And it's the only one that actually matters.